Chapter 9, in which Thranduil is a dreadful nuisance and Cimmerine casts a spell. The rest of the trip home was uneventful. Passing through the king's cave seemed easier going in the opposite direction, and the impenetrable darkness only descended once. As soon as they arrived, Kazul took the book Morwen had lent them and curled herself around a rock just outside the mouth of the cave to study it, while Cimmerine made dinner. She pored over the book all evening, and Cimmerine found it fascinating to watch the dragon delicately turning the pages with her claws. Early the next day, Kazul went off to consult with Roxim. Cimmerine was rather stiff from all the dragon riding she had done the previous day, so she decided not to do any more cleaning. Instead, she spent the morning in Kazul's treasure room, sorting through likely-looking bottles and jars for those that might possibly contain powdered hen's teeth. Remembering Kazul's advice, she started by setting aside all of the bottles she could find that had lead stoppers. Since the light was not very good, she took the jars and bottles that looked as if they might be worth investigating and piled them into her apron so as to carry them outside more easily. She had nearly finished sorting when she heard a voice calling faintly in the distance. "Bother," she said. "I did hope they'd leave me alone a little longer." She bundled the last 5 bottles into her apron without looking at them and, not forgetting to lock the door behind her, hurried out through the maze to see who was shouting for her this time. It was Thranduil. "What are you doing here?" Cimmerine said crossly. "I told you I wasn't going to be ready to be rescued for at least a month." "I was worried," Thranduil said. "I heard that you'd broken a leg, but you look fine to me." "Of course I haven't broken a leg," Cimmerine said. "Where'd you get that idea?" "Some night at the inn at the foot of the mountain," Thranduil replied. "He was up yesterday talking to the princess he'd tried to rescue, and he came back and warned everybody not to bother with the princess that was captured by the dragon Kazul. Well, I knew that was you, so I asked why, and he said his princess told him you'd broke your leg and wouldn't be able to walk for months." Cimmerine smiled slightly. Alienora had apparently gone through with her plan to tell Helana about Cimmerine's twisted ankle, and Helana had decided to improve the story a little in hopes of reducing the competition. "Oh, somebody must have gotten it mixed up," Cimmerine said gently. "You can stop worrying. I'm fine. Is that all you came for? These jars are getting heavy and I've got work to do." "Cimmerine, we have to talk," Thranduil said in a heavy, deep voice. "Then we'll have to do it while I work," Cimmerine declared. She turned on her heel and marched into the kitchen full of annoyance. She had been feeling almost friendly toward Thranduil. I mean, he had been worried about her after all, until he said he wanted to talk. Cimmerine was quite sure that all he wanted to talk about was rescuing her, and she was annoyed with him for being so stupidly stubborn, and annoyed with herself for being so annoyed when he was only trying to do the best he could. Thranduil followed her into the kitchen. "What is all that?" he asked as Cimmerine put the aprons full of jars on the kitchen table and began lining them up. "Some things I'm checking on for Kazul," Cimmerine said. She picked up a small jar made of carved jade and pried the lid off. It was half full of a green salve. Cimmerine put the lid back on and set the jar aside. "What was it you wanted to talk about?" she asked, reaching for another jar. "You, dragons, us. That looks interesting. Can I help?" "As long as you don't break anything," Cimmerine said. "Some of these are very fragile. Maybe opening jars would make him forget about you, dragons, us, for a while." "I'll be very careful," Thranduil assured her. "This one looks like metal. I'll start with that, shall I?" He picked up one of the larger jars made of beaten copper with 2 handles. He frowned at the top, then reached for his dagger, and as he tilted the jar, Cimmerine saw the neck was stopped with lead. "No, not that one," she said quickly. She didn't remember picking out that particular jar. It must have been one of the last 4 or 5 she'd scooped up when she heard Thranduil calling. "Well, why not?" Thranduil said, sounding rather hurt. "I said I'd be careful." The tip of his dagger was already embedded in the lead. "Kazul said to leave the ones with lead stoppers alone," Cimmerine said, "so put it back." "If you insist," Thranduil said, shrugging. He pulled on his dagger, but it was stuck fast in the lead. "Drat," he said, and twisted the handle. The dagger came free, and the lead stopper came along with it. "Oh, I should have known," Cimmerine said in a resigned tone. A black cloud of smoke poured out of the jar. As Cimmerian and Thranduil watched it, it condensed into a dark-skinned giant wearing only a turban and a loincloth. He was more than twice as tall as Thranduil, and the corners of his mouth were turned down in a stern frown. "What is it?" whispered Thranduil. "Trouble," said Cimmerian. "Thou speakest truly, O daughter of wisdom," said the giant in a booming voice that filled the cave. "For I am a djinn, who is imprisoned in that jar, and I am the instrument of thy death, and that of thy paramour." "My what?" Cimmerian said, outraged. "Thy lover," the djinn said uncomfortably. "The man who stands beside thee." "I know what you meant," Cimmerian said, "but he isn't my lover or my fiancé or my boyfriend or anything, and I refuse to be killed with him." "But, Cimmerian, you know perfectly well," Thranduil started. "You hush," Cimmerian said. "You've made enough of a mess already." "If he is not thy paramour, nor any of those other things, then what is he?" the djinn asked suspiciously. "A nuisance," Cimmerian said succinctly. "Cimmerian, you're not being very kind," Thranduil said. "What he is matters not," said the djinn grandly after a moment's heavy thought. "It is enough that thou and he shall die." "Enough for whom?" Cimmerian said. The djinn blinked at her. "For me. 'Tis my will that thou and he shall die by my hand. Thou hast but to choose the manner of thy death." Old age," Cimmerian said promptly. "Mock me not. Thou and he shall die, and by my hand, ere this day draws to its close," the djinn cried. "Do you suppose he means it?" Thranduil said nervously. "Well, why would he keep bellowing at us if he didn't mean it?" Cimmerian said. "Do be quiet, Thranduil." Thranduil lowered his voice. "Should I, offer to fight him, do you think?" "Oh, don't be silly," Cimmerian said. She saw that Thranduil was distressed, so she added, "You came up here to fight a dragon. You weren't prepared for a djinn, and nobody could reasonably expect you to challenge him." "Oh, if you say so," Thranduil said, looking relieved. Cimmerian turned back to the djinn and saw that he, too, was looking perturbed. "What's the matter with you?" she said crossly. "Dost thou not wish to know why I will kill thee?" the djinn asked plaintively. "Well, what difference does it make?" Cimmerian said. "Yes, actually," Thranduil said at the same time. "Thranduil," Cimmerian said in exasperation, "shut up!" "Hear my story, O luckless pair," the djinn said with evident relief. "I am one of those djinn who did rebel against the law of our kind, and for my crimes I was sentenced to imprisonment in this bottle until the day should come when human hands would loose me. As is the custom of my people, I swore that whoso should release me during the first 100 years of my imprisonment, I would make ruler of the earth. Whoso should release me during the second 100 years, I should make rich beyond all dreams of men. And whoso shall release me during the third 100, I should grant 3 wishes. And whoso should release me after any longer span of time, I should grant only the choice of what death he would die." "You're going to kill us because it's traditional?" Cimmerian asked. "Yes," said the djinn. His eyes slid away from Cimmerian's, and she frowned suddenly. "Just how long were you in that jar?" she demanded. Well, actually," the djinn's voice trailed off. "How long?" Cimmerian insisted. 217 years, the djinn admitted. "But nobody ever releases a djinn before the 300 years are over." "You're trying to get around your oath," Thranduil said, plainly shocked at the very thought. "You pretended you had to kill us so you wouldn't have to give us the wishes." "No," said the djinn. "Thinkest thou that the granting of wishes alone would so trouble me? Needs must I kill thee and thy fair companion, for I cannot return home and say that thou didst release me and I left thee living. Oh, I would be a laughing stock. Never in 3,000 years has such a thing occurred." "Well, then you shouldn't have sworn an oath," Thranduil said sternly. "I had to," the djinn said miserably. "It is the custom of our kind. 'Twould be improper," Cimmerian murmured. "'Twould be improper to do otherwise," the djinn said, nodding. "But now thou hast found me out, and what am I to do? If I kill thee, it'll violate my oath. If I kill thee not, the remainder of my life will be a torment." You could go back in the jar for another 83 years, Cimarine suggested delicately. I could go back? The djinn blinked at her for a moment. I could go back! I could go back! And in 83 years, we'll both be dead of old age, Cimarine said. Since that was my choice of death, your oath will be fulfilled, and you can go straight home without killing anyone else or giving him any riches or power or anything. Truly, thou art a jewel among women, and the very queen of wisdom's daughters, said the djinn happily. Thou hast found the perfect solution to my difficulties. Well, wait a minute, Thranduil said. What about those wishes? Thranduil, Cimarine said in a shocked tone, I'm surprised at you. How can he give us wishes if he's going back in the jar for 83 years? It wouldn't be right at all. Thranduil frowned. Are you sure? I mean, after all, we did let him out during the 300 years. I suppose I could let thee have one wish at least, in token of my thanks for thy help, the djinn said, as long as thou dost not tell anyone. I wouldn't dream of it, Thranduil assured him, and my wish is to defeat a dragon and win his princess's hand in marriage. The djinn waved a dark hand over Thranduil's head. There. When next thou dost fight a dragon, thou shalt surely defeat him. And thou, he said, turning to Cimarine. I could use some powdered hen's teeth, Cimarine said. The djinn blinked in surprise, but he waved his hand again, his face a mask of concentration. Then he bowed and handed Cimarine a fat brown jar. There's thy desire. Farewell! With an elaborate salaam, the djinn dissolved back into a cloud of smoke that poured back into the copper jar from which it had come. Cimarine leaned over and plucked the lead stopper from the end of Thranduil's knife. She jammed it back into place and heaved a sigh of relief. Thranduil was not paying attention. What did you want something like that for? He asked, looking at the jar of hen's teeth and wrinkling his nose in distaste. I don't believe I shall tell you, Cimarine said, putting the jar carefully into one of her apron pockets. It has nothing to do with you. Well, nothing to do with me, I like that, Thranduil said indignantly. I'm going to marry you just as soon as I beat that dragon of yours. I don't think you're going to beat Kazul, Cimarine said in a considering tone. But that djinn just said... He said that if you fight a dragon, you'll defeat him. But Kazul is a her, not a him, Cimarine pointed out. And you ought not trying to be rescuing me anyway. Well, why not? Thranduil asked truculently. Because there are other princesses who've been captains of dragons for much longer than I have, and they have seniority, Cimarine explained. Oh, said Thranduil, looking considerably taken aback. How do you know? They came to visit and told me all about it, Cimarine said. I think you should try for Caradol. She's from the kingdom of Raxwell, and her hair is the color of sun-ripened wheat, and she wears a gold crown set with diamonds. You ought to get along with her very well. Thranduil brightened perceptibly at this description, but said, But everyone expects me to rescue you. As long as you defeat a dragon and rescue a princess, no one will care, Cimarine said firmly, and Caradol will suit you much better than I would. Are you sure her dragon isn't female, too? Positive, Cimarine said. Gornal's cave is 2 down and 3 over. If you follow the path outside, you can't miss it. He ought to be there now, and if you leave right away, you'll be able to get everything settled before dinner. Well, all right then, Thranduil said, as long as you're sure you don't mind. Not at all, Cimarine assured him fervently. She saw him to the mouth of the cave and pointed him toward Gornal's cave, and then returned to the kitchen. She gathered up the jars and bottles she had been planning to check, except for the copper jar with the gin inside, and took them back to the treasure vault. Then she fetched an inkpot, a quill pen, and a sheet of paper from the library and began writing out a warning to attach to the copper jar. She didn't want anyone else to open it until the 83 years were over and the djinn could go home without killing anyone. She was just finishing when she heard Alienora's voice calling from the rear of the cave. I'm in the kitchen, she shouted. Come on back. You're always in the kitchen, Alienora said when she poked her head through the door a moment later. Or the library. Don't you ever do anything but cook and read? Look at this, Alienora, Cimarine said, handing her the warning she had been writing. Do you think it's clear enough? Warning. This jar contains a djinn who will kill you if you let him out too soon. Do not open till at least 105 years after the date when the citadel of the Yellow Giant was destroyed. Eleanor read out loud. That's, let's see, 84 years from now? Seems clear to me. You'd have to be pretty stupid to ignore a warning like that. Maybe I ought to show it to Helena and see what she says, Cimarine said, frowning. I wouldn't want anyone to get in trouble by accident just because I didn't make it plain. Oh, it's plain, Eleanor said. Cimarine, what on earth have you been doing? How do you know there's a djinn in this bottle? Oh, Thranduil, Cimarine said, waving a hand expressively. I was looking through some of the bottles from Kazul's treasure room to see if any of them happened to have hen's teeth in them, and Thranduil came in and wanted to help. And he opened it? Eleanor said. Oh dear. Exactly, said Cimarine. But it came out well in the end. I think I've gotten rid of him for good. I sent him off to rescue Caradel. You did? Well, what if he doesn't beat Gornal? Oh, he'll win. The djinn gave him a wish, and he wished to defeat a dragon. Cimarine looked apologetically at Eleanor. I suppose I ought to have sent him to rescue you, but... Oh, that's quite all right, Eleanor said hastily. Getting rid of Caradel will help a lot. And after everything you've told me about Thranduil, I don't think I'd want to have him rescue me. That's what I thought, Cimarine said. Oh, and I finally got the djinn to give me some powdered hen teeth, so we can finally try that fireproofing spell. Good, Eleanor said. Let's do it right now. So Cimarine got out the spell and the ingredients she had collected, and she and Eleanor spent the next hour on various necessary preparations. First, they had to boil some unicorn water and steep the dried wolfsbane in it. Then the mixture had to be strained and mixed with the hippopotamus oil and the powdered hen's teeth. Cimarine did most of that, while Eleanor ground up the blue rose leaves and the piece of ebony. Grinding the ebony took a long time, but fortunately they didn't need much. When Eleanor finally had enough, Cimarine mixed it with the blue rose leaves and more of the unicorn water in one of Kazul's recently shed scales. Each mixture had to be stirred 3 times counterclockwise with a white eagle feather. Then Eleanor dipped the point of her feather in the mixture and began drawing a star on the floor of the cave. Is this going to be big enough for both of us? She asked, scratching busily at the stone with the tip of the feather. I think so, Cimarine answered. Don't try to make it too big or you'll run out of liquid and we'll have to start over. Eleanor did not run out, though she had used nearly all her mixture by the time she finished. There, she said. She sat back on her heels and studied her diagram to make sure there were no gaps. Then she set her dragon scale and feather aside and stood up. Your turn. First, we have to get into the center of the star, Cimarine reminded her. Be careful not to smudge the lines. Smudge them? After all that work? Eleanor said in tones of mock horror. She lifted her skirts and stepped carefully into the middle of the diagram. Cimarine followed, carrying a small mixing bowl half full of something that looked like brown sludge with a white eagle feather sticking out of one side. Oh, it smells awful, Cimarine said, grimacing. It doesn't matter what it smells like as long as the spell works, Cimarine said. Ready? Oh, as ready as I'm ever going to be, Eleanor replied, shutting her eyes and screwing up her face as if she expected to have a glass of cold water poured over her head. Cimarine plucked the eagle feather out of the bowl and raised it quickly over Eleanor's head before it could drip on the floor. She let 4 large drops of the brown gunk fall onto Eleanor's hair, then brushed the end of the feather across her forehead twice. She finished by drawing a circle with the feather on the palm of Eleanor's left hand. That tickles, Eleanor complained. Well, you can do it to me now, Cimarine said. Eleanor took the bowl and feather from Cimarine. You're right, Cimarine said a moment later. It does tickle. Now what? Eleanor said. Set the bowl down and shut your eyes, Cimarine instructed. When Eleanor had done so, Cimarine closed her own eyes and said, Power of water, wind, and earth, turn the fire back to its birth. Raise the spell to shield the flame by the power that we have tamed. Oh, said Eleanor, that feels peculiar. Can I open my eyes now? Yes, said Cimarine, opening her own. We're finished. Did it work? Eleanor asked, cautiously opening one eye and squinting at Cimarine. Well, something happened. We both felt it, Cimarine said. And your hair and forehead don't have the brown gunk on them anymore. Eleonora promptly opened both eyes and studied Cimarine. Neither do yours. What does that mean? It means we go back to the kitchen and test it, Cimarine said. She bent over and picked up the mixing bowl. We'll clean up later. Come on.